Assalamu alaikum, bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So today we're going to talk about colonization, both the intellectual and political forms of colonization that took place in the Muslim world. We've already talked about, the Young Turks and the Tanzimat and those types of things, so now we're going to get a little more into the nitty-gritty of the decline of the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. And we're going to talk about essentially how European powers took control of Muslim lands, or how Muslim countries became intellectually colonialized and economically undermined. And this is the last lecture in our series. I hope you're having a wonderful Thanksgiving break, whether you celebrate it or not. And I hope you're diligently working on your final papers, and please do feel free to reach out to me if you need any help with your final papers whatsoever. أهلا وسهلا السلام عليكم يا طلاب العلم. And so we're going to be talking, like I said, about colonialism. And so this is a map of the Sykes-Picot agreement. Picot is a French name, so it's not pronounced Picot. A lot of people say Sykes-Picot, but it's actually Sykes-Picot. And it just kind of shows you how colonial forces tried to divvy up the Middle East amongst themselves. So these Europeans are trying to divide up the Islamic world amongst themselves for their own, what's the word I'm looking for? Because they basically want to pillage these lands. So it's for their own economic profit to divvy it up this way. Prevents wars between the European powers, and they all get a piece of the pie being the Muslim world. And then you have the Middle East in 1930, the next map there, which shows basically how modern nation states started to appear and what they started to look like, and it's starting to look a lot closer to the modern Middle East that we know here and now today. Now, when we read an Imam in Paris by Tahdawi, and we also looked at, Jabarti's chronicle of Napoleon's invasion into Egypt. And so we talked about the Mamluk rulers and things like that, but who came to power after all of that was Muhammad Ali Pasha, or Pasha, with a B in Arabic and a P in Turkish, right? But I like to call him Muhammad Ali Pasha because I used to live in Egypt and that's what comes natural. But Muhammad Ali Pasha al-Mas'ud bin Agha. And so his reign was from 1805 to 1848, and he was Albanian. I don't know if he was one of the Janissary or how this Albanian man came to rule Egypt. I don't know specifically, but he was Albanian, so he was white. He famously had blue eyes, and he's depicted there sitting on the couch talking to European officials. And the map on the bottom right-hand side shows all the swath of territory that Muhammad Ali Pasha essentially ruled over as a representative of the Ottoman Caliphate. But he was a bit unruly, kind of went against the Ottomans sometimes, but he was considered the wali of Egypt, or the regent of Egypt, and he wanted to kind of continue this reform that Sultan Selim III had initiated, but he was deposed and ultimately killed because of that. However, Muhammad Ali Pasha, or Mehmet Ali Pasha, wanted to continue this endeavor. And he implemented what was probably the first ever modern police force in the Islamic world. And mostly that was in Cairo and Alexandria. And he industrialized or brought modern Western capitalism to Egypt with weapons manufacturing and textiles. And, you know, Egyptian's famous for its cotton, right? Egyptian cotton, right? But due to the transatlantic slave trade, American produced cotton with slave labor was cheaper and outcompeted Egypt, and so the Egyptian economy was started to slowly but surely tank. And this led to a decline in the Ottoman Empire economically. And many Europeans were sent to Egypt and the rest of the Ottoman Empire to create Western-style schools. So Muhammad Ali Pasha was modernizing Egypt in multiple different ways. And he sent promising citizens to Europe to study, and so that they could build a European-style army. And they studied European languages like French, German, English, Italian, Spanish, and so on. And they translated military manuals or texts into Arabic. And they would come back to the Ottoman Empire and, be very European, like culturalized or Europeanized, sometimes wearing Western dress from then on out and things like that. And the dynasty that he established would rule Egypt all the way until the modern period, all the way until 1952. So this kind of system of governments that Muhammad Ali Pasha set up outlived the Ottoman Empire itself. And then King Farouk, was overthrown by Gamal Abdel Nasser, and that established the Republic of Egypt as we know it. So all of it goes back to Muhammad Ali Pasha. And the Cairo Citadel has a mosque that's built by him there. I don't know if you remember from previous weeks when we talked about the Mamluks. I was at the Cairo Citadel there at Masjid Qalawun, and next to it is Masjid Muhammad Ali Pasha. So, both of them are there, and that is how modern Egypt came to be. But Muhammad Ali Pasha is important to understand if you want to understand Ottoman history, because he was such an instrumental figure. And this is Selim III, who I had mentioned just in the previous slide. And he, was known for trying to modernize or reform the Ottoman Empire in various ways. But it says here, the 60-year period from the ascent of the Ottoman Sultan Selim III to the death of Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali Pasha defines an era of state-sponsored military reforms, during which the rulers of the Ottoman Empire and Egypt sought to remake their armed forces in the European image. And so this is from Cleveland and Button's very famous book, A History of the Modern Middle East. And, fun fact, the boxer Muhammad Ali is named after Muhammad Ali Pasha. But Selim, he came to the throne during a war with Austria and Russia. So the Ottoman Empire was being encroached upon by, Europe and Russia for both sides. So you got Russia over here, Europe over here, and they're enclosing in on the Ottoman Empire. You have Muhammad Ali Pasha rebelling sometimes against the Ottoman Empire. So from like all fronts, you have the Ṣafavids. Also, all fronts are just squeezing and squishing the Ottoman Empire right now. And so they're in a state of decline. They're facing pressure from every different angle. And so Salem was compelled to conclude the treaties of Sistova with Austria and Jassy with Russia. And in 1798, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt drove Salem into alliance with Great Britain and Russia. And so after the French left Egypt in 1801, Salem, dazzled with Napoleon's success in Europe, not only recognized him as emperor, but also under the influence of General Sebastiani, and that's an Italian name most likely because Napoleon himself was Italian. So under the influence of General Sebastiani, Napoleon's ambassador in Constantinople declared war 1806 on Russia and Great Britain. So there's some complicated politics going on between Napoleon and the Ottoman Empire and Britain and Russia. Things were becoming quite complicated for the Ottoman Empire. In addition to outside powers and internal warlords, the Ottoman government faced another threat to its territorial integrity during the 19th century: nationalist independence movements by its European subjects. The new ideology of nationalism, or nation-statehood, with its central principle that people speaking the same language and holding shared memories of a common past should form distinct political states. This endangered the imperial religious structure on which the Ottoman Empire rested. And that's why I'm having you read The Impossible State by Wa'il Halaq, because it gets, at this point, much more deeply than Cleveland and Button ever could. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of dualism and, frankly, cognitive dissonance amongst the Muslim élite, where both Islamic institutions and epistemologies, that is, ways of thinking, sat alongside contradictory and antithetical institutions and epistemologies from European thought: capitalism, race theory, eugenics, Darwinism, nation-statehood, materialism, secularism, the list goes on. And these systems of thought started to colonize the Muslim world, where they began to think that race is a natural thing, that capitalism is a natural thing, nation-statehood is a natural thing, that these things kind of has always existed, which is just historically not true. Muslims began to understand their own society through Orientalist eyes. Heretical movements sprang up based off Orientalism, such as the Quranists, or Quraniyun, who denied all ahadith as apocryphal, such as Orientalists argued, most notably Ignaz Goldziher. Eastern European and Arab nationalism suddenly became major forces that undermined the pre-modern concept of empire. The empire was the natural way of states since the Sassanids and Byzantines, and even before that. Empire was the system of government that the Mongolians used, the system of government that the Mughals, Safavids, and Ottomans understood. It was the system of government of the Umayyads, of the Abbasids, and all that came later until now. Suddenly, Greece wants its national independence. Suddenly, the Slavic states in Eastern Europe want their independence. Cyprus. All these places. And people like the Armenians saw themselves suddenly as being separate from the Islamic Empire, from the Ottoman Empire. Arabs started to see themselves as distinctly different from Turks, and therefore should have their own nation. Lawrence of Arabia went there and inculcated these ideas as a British spy. He was an Orientalist hired by the British military, essentially, to go and become a spy in what's now Saudi Arabia, getting the Saudi Arabs, or just the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula, to rebel against their Turkish overlords, and telling them that they needed to make their own nation states. In Anatolia itself, the Janissaries were ended as an institution, as well as Mamluks in the Egypt. These Mamluk soldiers and Janissaries are something that go all the way back to the early period in Islamic history, now disbanded. Age-old traditions are suddenly changing. And these modernization policies that the Tanzimat and the Young Turks implemented had the unintended effect of marginalizing Islamic institutions and those trained in them. Although both governments, the Ottomans and Egyptians, it's really one government, although both governments devoted considerable funds to the development of European-style academies, they did not close the doors of the religious schools. These schools, despite a decline in their prestige, continued to preserve the Islamic learned tradition, to transmit Islamic values and provide education opportunities for large numbers of students. The problem arose when the graduates of Islamic schools sought employment in administration that were committed, for better or worse, to policies of westernization. No matter how extensive these students' knowledge of the Quran or the Sharia may have been, they did not have the qualifications to compete with the students trained in Europe or European-style schools. Modernization of the government had slowly been taking place, and the marginalization of traditional Islamic knowledge had slowly been taking place. World War I roped in the Ottoman Empire in 1914, and unfortunately, the Ottoman Empire pretty much lost every battle and lost on every front, and they officially lost the entire war in 1918. In 1918, the economy was in utter shambles and was extremely close to complete bankruptcy. The financial losses were huge, with an expense of 398.5 million Ottoman lira, which at the time was the equivalent of basically 9 billion gold francs, or what it comes to be about 21 million nowadays. I'm not sure how accurate that calculation is. The Turkish War of Independence was waged from 1919 to 1923, was a series of military campaigns waged by the Turkish national movement, which Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was a big part of. And so parts of the Ottoman Empire were occupied and partitioned following its defeat in World War I, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk emerged the dictator of the Republic of Turkey. And this brought forth the age of dictators like Gamal Abdel Nasser. And we see the Ba'ath Party come up in both Syria and Iraq, and famously we see Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya. We know who's in charge of Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And we currently live, since Ataturk, in the age of dictators. The Muslim world is governed essentially by dictators. And they pose as democracies, but they don't function as democracies, as we know. And Ataturk was a secularist who de-Islamicized Turkey. He even made Sufi brotherhoods and many types of Islamic gatherings completely illegal. He didn't allow Ottoman Turkish to be written anymore, and they did this whole thing where they Latinized Turkish by giving the Latin script and taking away all the Arabic and Persian words and replacing it with indigenous Turkic words, which they revived from other Turkic-speaking ethnicities such as Kazakhstanis, Uzbekis, and things like that. Different ethnicities, in Central Asia like that are Turkic-speaking, the Uyghurs and all that. And so they kind of Turkized and secularized the Turkish language itself, and they replaced the Ottoman Majella, or Islamic law, with the secular law. Hijab was often banned in many spaces. You couldn't wear hijab in university, for instance. Madrasas were banned. And in the summer of 1924, Ataturk invited this American educational reformer, John Dewey, maybe you've heard of the Dewey Decimal System, to Ankara to advise him on how to reform Turkish education into a secular education. So that is essentially how the Ottoman Empire ended. And some people think, that's the end of the caliphate as well. Some people consider the Ottomans as a caliphate, although that's highly contentiously debated. But yes, that is how the Ottoman Empire ended and became the Republic of Turkey. And here, just briefly, you can see the Ottoman Empire and all the battles kind of laid out that the Ottoman Empire faced around World War I. They're fighting all kinds of battles with Russia. They're fighting all kinds of battles with Britain and France. Right? They were allied with Germany, which is why to this day so many Turks are still going to Germany, why so many Turks to this day still speak German, why you can find easily German bookstores in Turkey. But look at all these battles, and battle after battle after battle after battle, the Ottomans lost. They committed the Armenian genocide. They were fighting the Arabs because Lawrence of Arabia and many other British spies were there agitating the Arabs against the Ottoman Empire. They were agitating the Arabs to fight against the caliphate, to get their own independent nation state. And you can just see that not only were they being undermined economically, but also on every single military front. I mean, they're just fighting battle after battle after battle after battle after battle and losing and losing and losing. So it became almost impossible, you could say, for the Ottoman Empire to continue. And so we've seen how the Ottoman Empire went in decline. And there's you might say, a strong parallel with the Mughals, and we'll get to them in a moment. But what about Persia? Persia, colonization took on a different form. So after the death of Shah Abbasi I in 1629, the Safavid dynasty lasted for about a century, and it was a period of decline. Isfahan fell to the Ghilzai Afghans of Kandahar, and then the Safavid Persia, it collapsed, and you went through these series of short dynasties. You had the Afsharid dynasty, Zanddynasty, Qajar dynasty, and then you got the modern Pahlavi Empire, where the Shah, as pictured there with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was in control. He was Western educated. He spoke English without hardly an accent. I think he spoke French pretty well as also. His wife, Farah Pahlavi, she wrote her autobiography, memoir in French. And they were very westernized. They invited European diplomats over all the time and spoiled them with grand parties. They reigned from 1925 to 1979. But all during this time where you had these series of short dynasties, and even all throughout the Pahlavi Empire, basically the Russians and British had colonized sections of Persia and were stealing all of the oil from Persia. The Caspian Sea, which is north of Persia, is where all the world's caviar supply comes from. And aren't the Russians known for loving caviar? And so all of the caviar and the money that would be that Iran would make off of caviar was going to Europe. And these were the major financial exportations that were happening, was oil and caviar. And after the Islamic Revolution, caviar still, even now, is a major export along with oil. And even now, a lot of it goes to Russia. But the British were trying to control a lot of Iran, and then later America got involved and was trying to control a lot of Iran. So, the Shah was closely allied with Western powers, and he was allowing them to basically pillage his country in a way. Maybe he didn't have power to stop anything. Allahu alam bis-sawab. But he held these extravagant parties. I mean, they would just build it cost millions of dollars, and he would build a whole entire tent city in the desert for European guests, and they would have the most luxurious, lavish foods you can imagine. And meanwhile, the average Iranian, the average Persian citizen, lived in poverty. And he alienated the religious ulama. He alienated the Shia clergy and the normal religious Iranian, and as well as the rural farmers. And all of that discontent boiled over, and it led to the Islamic Revolution in 1978, 1979. Where the Shah was deposed. He left Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini, came to power. He was in France, and his tapes had been circulating in Iran for a while now, and so he came from France over to Iran and took over as basically the dictator. And you had the Iranian hostage crisis, which didn't end until 1981. And they were, getting involved in American politics by, President Carter not allowing the hostages to be released during his presidency, but only after Ronald Reagan got elected. So you can see they were playing quite a bit of games there. And President Carter had the famous attempt to rescue the hostages that ended in disaster, where you had a helicopter crash in the desert in Iran. And so it was just a very tumultuous time, but they did not want to be colonized, and therefore they did a revolution against the Shah, and all the power to them in that regard. And nowadays we hear all the things we hear with the uranium enrichment and all this and that. And that's because they're trying to defend themselves. They're collectively traumatized by colonialism. Same thing you can see with North Korea. Korea is a country that has always been invaded by China, by Japan, by America, everybody. And so North Korea has made itself in this hyper-paranoid defensive position from the collective trauma of colonization. And I don't regard either one as a threat to American security, honestly. Cuba either. Same thing going on with Cuba. You know, these are anti-colonial expressions of, power. We're not going to be colonialized anymore, colonized anymore. And so that's kind of how I understand modern Iran and its transition from the Safavid dynasty to the Shah and to the Islamic Revolution. In one way, you could say the Ottoman Empire was doomed before it ever really got started. And that's because this was the age of exploration, or the age of discovery for Europeans, where you had the Portuguese man Vasco da Gama. He sailed from Portugal around Africa. He also made contact with Brazil. And he went around Africa and established a trade route with India, one that hadn't been going since Roman times. And he also, there's people who made it all the way to Indonesia, which has newly been converted to Islam, to the Philippines, which also was in the process of being converted to Islam. To this day, you still have regions of the Philippines that are Islamic. Kazakhstan, West Africa, all on the edges of the Islamic world are converting to Islam. The Punjab and the Bengal converting to Islam, when all of a sudden the age of exploration is happening and colonization. The age of exploration morphed into colonization after the, Enlightenment, race theory, Darwinism, eugenics, and all that stuff. That was the ideological backdrop that promoted colonialism, as well as spreading Christianity to the heathens. And so, you had this route that is suddenly discovered, even though overland trade routes through the Muslim empire have been going on the entire time. And this is one of the ways that the economies of the Muslim world, the Islamicate world, was undermined by having shipping routes that undermined the land trade routes. And because the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire were separate, they couldn't properly keep a monopoly. And so you had Europeans trading with India, undermining the economy of the Ottomans, and the Mughals didn't really care. And it became quite the predicament. And this is also the same time, you got to remember, Christopher Columbus's first voyage was in 1492, only 5 years before Vasco da Gama. And so what used to be Islamic Spain is now one of the main perpetrators of colonization. And you might say that the fall of Islamic Spain was really an allusion to the fall of the Islamicate world as a whole. Islamdom as a whole suffered from that point onward. I consider that really the major turning point in Islamic history. So the search for the wealth and prosperity of India led to the colonization of the Americas after Christopher Columbus went to the Americas in 1492. Only a few years later, near the end of the 15th century, Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama became the first European to re-establish direct trade links with India since Roman times, by being the first to arrive by circumnavigating Africa. The next to arrive were the Dutch, with their main base in Ceylon. Their expansion into India was halted after their defeat in the Battle of Colachel by the Kingdom of Travancore, I don't know, during the war they had with the Dutch there. And if you look at the growth of the Mughal Empire, we talked previously about Jalaluddin Akbar and Aurangzeb, or Alamgir as he's known. And Alamgir, he added everything that you see there in orange. And so the Mughals basically controlled most of India, including south of the Deccan, plateau. And the British East India Company, they came there as merchants. They're actually, pictured in manuscripts as being in the Mughal court, visiting the Mughal emperor. They were founded in 1600, and as the empire weakened, the British began to exert more influence over Mughal rulers, and in 1757, British forces defeated the Nawab, the ruler of Bengal, and French forces at the Battle of Plassey. The East India Company thereafter took political control of much of the Indian subcontinent. Although Mughal emperors maintained their thrones, they had little real power. During the Indian Mutiny of 1857-59, the British exiled the last Mughal emperor. So that is essentially the decline of the Mughals. And so these trading companies that were established during the Age of Exploration became huge major companies back in their European homelands. So like the East India Company became this massive source of revenue, through taxes to the British Crown. And so if there is a business disturbance overseas, that tax money stops flowing to the Crown. Suddenly it becomes a political issue, and now the Crown itself exerts military power to keep this capitalist, what we would nowadays call corporation, alive and going. So colonization was directly a product of capitalist thought, right? So we have to keep in mind how everything's so interconnected. And so Great Britain and France in the latter 18th century struggled for dominance over India, partly through proxy Indian rulers, but also by direct military intervention, as we just mentioned. The defeat of the formidable Indian ruler Tipu Sultan in 1799 marginalized the French influence. This was followed by a rapid expansion of British power through the greater part of the Indian subcontinent in the early 19th century. By the middle of the century, the British had already gained direct or indirect control of almost all of India, as shown in the map on the upper right. British India, consisting of the directly ruled British presidencies and provinces, they contained the most populous and valuable parts of the British Empire. Okay, this was the core of the British economy, and it became known as the jewel in the British Crown. And in 1947, India gained its independence and was partitioned into the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan, the latter of which was created as a homeland for colonial India's Muslims. The Muslims had to create their own separate nation state in order to survive, or they could be the product of mass slaughter and communal violence, which is what we still see today. And Modi makes it worse. He fans the flames of communal violence. And so you have the famous Quran translator Leopold Weiss, known as Muhammad Asad, author of his famous autobiography, The Road to Mecca. In 1947, he was appointed director of the Department of Islamic Reconstruction by the government of Pakistan, where he made recommendations on the drafting of Pakistan's first constitution. And he stepped down from official life to write his famous autobiography, The Road to Mecca, which I highly recommend everybody read. I read it when I was a new Muslim, and it was an extremely enlightening book. Muhammad Asad, or Leopold Weiss, converted to Islam in Israel, and he fought against colonialists physically, smuggling weapons for, the Egyptians to fight their independence, and I believe the Libyans as well. He lived in Egypt, Israel, Palestine, in Saudi Arabia. He lived in Iraq, in Iran, and in India, Pakistan. And he wrote many influential books. Any book from him, I highly recommend you read it. And he did his famous translation of the Quran. His son Talal Asad is a famous anthropologist who studies the genealogy or the history of this concept that we call secular. He's very famous for that and doing anthropology of the Muslim world, such as anthropology of suicide bombers, and how secularism came to the Muslim world. And that's why I assigned his book Secular Transformations, or Transformations of the Secular, I can't remember, on the syllabus there for you to read. And it's highly important to understand how this concept of secularism came to the Islamic world and how it was received and digested by the Arab world as well as the broader Islamicate world. And as mentioned before, it's pronounced the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was put forth in 1916, so before the Ottomans had officially capitulated World War I, but it was pretty clear that they were going to lose. And so the British and French, who the Ottomans were fighting, made this agreement. It's also called the Asia Minor Agreement. Asia Minor is another name for Anatolia, or what's modern-day Turkey. It was a secret convention made during World War I between Great Britain and France, with Imperial Russia being involved, Tsarist Russia, for the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. See, this was their goal. Fighting the Ottomans wasn't a mean of just fighting an enemy and repelling them. No. There was colonial ambitions all along, and this led to the division of Turkish-held Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine into various French, British administered areas. Negotiations were begun as early as November 1915, just a year after the Ottomans joined World War I. And the final agreement took its name from the chief negotiators from Britain, France, Sir Mark Sykes, and Francois Georges Picot. Sergei Dmitrievich Sazonov was also present to represent Russia. And the Arabs had learned about the Sykes-Picot Agreement through, the publication of it in Western languages, right? And in Arab language newspapers. And they were scandalized by it. They felt that this was a major betrayal. It conflicted with peace agreements and pledges already given by the British to the Hashemite dynasty of Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca. And you had this whole Hussein McMahon correspondence that was based on the understanding that Arabs would eventually receive independence as, independent nation states, not as colonies. And so Hussein had brought the Arabs of the Hejaz in revolt against the Turks because of this promise the British made to them, because of people like Lawrence of Arabia who went there and told them that the British, Empire was trying to support them to be independent nation states, which wasn't the case. Now they were being suzerainties and colonies and protectorates and things like that, which is not what was ever agreed upon. And despite the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British still appeared to support Arab self-determination at first, helping Hussein's son Faisal and his forces press into Syria and establish a government in Damascus. In April 1920, however, just 3 years before the end of the Ottoman Caliphate, the Allied powers agreed to divide governance of the region into separate Class A mandates at the Conference of San Remo, along lines similar to those agreed upon under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The borders of these mandates split up Arab lands and ultimately led to the modern borders of Iraq, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as Kuwait. Even though the borders of the mandates were not determined until several years after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the fact that the deal set the framework for these borders stoked lingering resentment well into the 21st century. It's even mentioned in many of ISIS or Daesh's videos, and Al-Qaeda's videos mention it as well. Pan-Arabists oppose splitting up the mostly Arab-populated territories into separate countries, which they considered to be little more than imperialist impositions, divide and conquer. Moreover, the borders split up other contiguous populations like the Kurds and the Druze and left them as minority populations in several countries, depriving their communities of self-determination altogether. And as we mentioned with the concept of the nation-statehood, it's supposed to be one ethnicity, one language, one cultural memory. And so when you have all of a sudden minorities being split up into different countries, it leads a lot of times to not only discrimination, marginalization, but actual genocide, as right-wing fascist conservatives try to purify the country from ethnic minorities. We've seen this with Nazis, of course, but also Saddam Hussein tried to do this to the Shia, tried to do this to the Kurds, and make Iraq just a Sunni Arab country. Turkey also has had a long, tumultuous history with the Kurds, and of course the Armenian genocide that they still to this day really don't acknowledge. You have obviously all the stuff we know with Israel and Palestine. Palestine still remaining in a colonial state, with Israel essentially doing genocide against Palestine. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement has caused quite a lot of violence, massive amount of violence in the Middle East. Moments of political turmoil were often met with declarations of the end of Sykes-Picot, such as the establishment of the Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq in 1992, or like I said, the rise of ISIS in 2014, 2015. Meanwhile, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is often criticized, together with the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence and the Balfour Declaration, as contradictory promises made by Britain to France, the Arabs, and the Zionist movement. Britain was lying to all of them. And this is why I strongly recommend that you watch that film, Lawrence of Arabia, in this week's module, as well as Lion of the Desert, starring Anthony Quinn. Both of those movies capture this time period where there was a resistance to colonization. There was also, this type of spying going on by people like Lawrence of Arabia, and undermining of the Ottoman Empire by the British Empire. All of these things going on all around the same era. Now I'm going to pivot here to Edward Wadi' Said, the author of Orientalism. And he wrote his book. It came out right at the same time as the Iranian Revolution, around 1978, 79. And so right as there was this sudden interest in Orientalism again, sudden interest in the Middle East again, Orientalism was also under heavy attack and scrutiny, right? And so Edward Said's book was able to ride this wave of, wait a minute, maybe we don't really know anything about the Middle East. Maybe everything that Orientalists have been saying all along is a lie. And of course that undermines an entire field of knowledge, and of course they're going to want to defend themselves, which some people did attempt to do, but most people adjusted and took these critiques seriously and said, you know what, we need to change the way that we do scholarship. So Edward Said, he was born in 1935 in what's Palestine, or the protectorate of Palestine under the British. But he was raised in Egypt. He did a bachelor's degree at Princeton University in 1957, a master's degree at Harvard in 1960, and he did a PhD also at Harvard, and all of them were in English literature. And everything he learned from literary theory, literary critique, he applied to Orientalist writings, looking at them as literature. And in 1963, he started teaching at Columbia University, one of the Ivy Leagues, in the English and Comparative Literature department, and he stayed there until his death, I believe it was from leukemia, in 2003. And he was disturbed by the racism and Islamophobia that he witnessed as an Arab in academia, even though he was a Christian Arab. He says, wow, there's all this anti-Arab, anti-Islam rhetoric. Even though I'm not Muslim, I know that's not what Islam is. I know that's not what Muslims believe or do, and he could see the racism. So he used his tools of cultural critique and literary criticism against the racist colonizing field of Orientalism to gut its epistemological underpinnings. In other words, Orientalism really got supercharged with the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Many Orientalists came over to Egypt, as we saw with the letters that Napoleon would send out in Arabic, written by these Orientalists. So they were helping him to make propaganda. They were there. They were part of the colonial machine. You had Orientalist painters and Orientalist art. And he wanted to say, look, all of this whole entire field has been tightly connected with colonization from its beginning. And therefore, we must critique this as being a form of racist control and power over the non-white. And it's knowledge as power. And he was critiquing Orientalism to make, in hopes that Orientalism would take a less oppressive approach to studying the other. And the word that he uses actually is libertarian, to take a more libertarian approach where you don't have power over the other. You're giving them their liberty, their freedom, right? And so according to Edward Said's analysis, Orientalism has three interrelated definitions. It's an academic field of inquiry. It's a worldview, a system of representation, and a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. And it was a powerful tool of intellectual and colonial domination. In other words, it spewed out propaganda for colonial domination, like we mentioned with those letters from Napoleon. And Edward doubted this binary between East and West, or Dar al-Harb versus Dar al-Islam, a distinction that did not exist until the Islamic expansion, which cut off half of Rome from itself. Rome ruled all around the entire Mediterranean, including North Africa, including Carthage and Morocco, right? And so when the Islamic expansion initially happened under the Khulafa Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, it split up the Mediterranean world in half. And, that was severely traumatic for the Roman Empire. And that was remembered in European thought, until our current time. European literature for Said carried actualized and propelled Orientalist notions forward and constantly reinforced them. Put differently, literature produced by Europeans made possible the domination of the people of the East because of the Orientalist discourse embedded within these texts. In other words, all of European literature served as a way of propagating European domination. So literature is understood as a kind of carrier and distributor of ideology. And so his book Orientalism proposes that much of the Western study of Islamic civilization was an exercise in political intellectualism, a psychological exercise in the self-affirmation of European identity, not an objective exercise of intellectual inquiry and the academic study of Eastern cultures. Therefore, Orientalism was a method of practical and cultural discrimination that was applied to non-European societies and peoples in order to establish European imperial domination. In justification of empire, the Orientalist claims to know more essential and definitive knowledge about the Orient than do the Orientals. The European is saying, I know more about you than you know about yourself. With an exceptionally Arab family name like Said, connected to an improbably British first name Edward, I was uncomfortably anomalous student all through my early years, a Palestinian going to school in Egypt with an English first name, an American passport, and no certain identity at all. To make matters worse, Arabic, my native language, and English, my school language, were inextricably mixed. I have never known which was my first language, and I have felt fully at home in neither, although I dream in both. Every time I speak an English sentence, I find myself echoing it in Arabic, and vice versa. And Edward Said, he said that 2002, just a year before he died. Another big thinker who tried to refute Orientalism and refute colonial thought is Wa'il Halaq, another Christian Arab, also a professor at Columbia University, and he wrote his famous book here, Restating Orientalism, restating Edward Said's book, Orientalism. And it has a subtitle, A Critique of Modern Knowledge. And so Professor Wa'il Halaq, he was born to a Christian family in Nazareth in 1955, and he graduated from the University of Haifa and then earned a master's degree and PhD from the University of Washington. He currently teaches at Columbia University, as I mentioned, just like Edward Said did. And he taught at McGill University in Canada for a while before that. And Professor Aziz Rana of Cornell Law School describes Restating Orientalism as a brilliant interrogation of Edward Said's famous concept, highlighting the extent which the issue of Orientalism is not simply one of problematic European authors, but instead goes to the heart of how the modern project itself constitutes subjects, knowledge, and power. It is essential reading and will be debated by scholars for years to come. Right? So basically what Wa'il Halaq is saying in his book, Restating Orientalism, is that Edward Said's critique didn't go deep enough, that it's not just Orientalism that's the problem, but it's Western thought as a whole. Modernity as a whole needs to be rejected because ultimately it's destructive to the rest of the world. And Walter Mignolo, professor at Duke University, said of Restating Orientalism that it is becoming increasingly evident amongst decolonial thinkers that colonial management, with or without colonies, with or without settlers, is a question of controlling and managing knowledge, and that power differential is implicit in agents, institutions, and languages of epistemic governance. Wa'il Halaq brilliantly drives us through a meticulous reading of Edward Said's Orientalism to the awareness that domination is grounded on epistemic sovereignty, and that liberation is unthinkable without epistemic freedom. In other words, Halaq's main argument is that Edward Said's book did not go far enough. It was not radical enough. Edward Said was still arguing from modernity itself, which is itself a European colonizing paradigm that is utterly unable to understand religious phenomena. He calls he calls modernity a psycho-epistemic disorder, right? That cannot understand pre-modern epistemology. And he says on page 234 of his book, secular humanism, anthropocentrism, Enlightenment rationalism, and liberalism, all of which rest on a mechanistic impulse and sovereign domination of the world, are increasingly viewed as too costly to maintain and as an excessive and unjustifiable, if not immoral, overreach. All this notwithstanding their benefits, undoubted benefits, with equally undoubted disastrous side effects. And this brings us to another scholar. Many of you may know, many of you have heard of him. He got some fame on YouTube here. Jonathan A.C. Brown, Professor Jonathan Andrew Cleveland Brown, graduated magna cum laude. That means with straight A's, my buddy. With a Bachelor of Arts in History in 2000 from Georgetown University. And he studied Arabic for a year at the Center for Arabic Study Abroad at the American University of Cairo, and completed his doctorate in Islamic thought at the University of Chicago, which is where I did my master's, in 2006. And he converted to Islam in 1997, and he now teaches at Georgetown University, one of the Ivy Leagues, baby. And the reason I'm bringing him up along with Edward Said, along with Wa'il Halaq, is because he has a very good critique of how Orientalism has understood Hadith, how Orientalists dealt with Hadith. And in his book, Hadith, he criticizes the modern Western historical critical method, HCM, as it was originally purported by Leopold von Ranke. He called it Historismus in German, or historicism, it's sometimes called. And it was used very heavily in biblical criticism, and Orientalists just took copy and paste from biblical criticism and tried to apply that to Islam to disastrous effects. And secularism is itself an entirely Western modern concept which emerged from the 30 Years' War, as we've talked about. And it's considered the most destructive and bloody wars in European history, which was completely fought over Christian sectarianism, Protestants versus Catholics. This intergenerational trauma was passed down in the concept of the public square and secularism. However, since this Christian civilization only knew Christian thought, it could not live up to their ideal of secular, but rather a nominal safe space for Christians of different denominations to work together collectively and politically for the common good. And I'm not trying to denigrate safe spaces, they're a serious thing. But here, it's not, this public square isn't really a safe space in the true sense of the word. It's just a place where Christians can get together and talk about things in a non-sectarian manner. It's not meant for people of other religions, really. It's exclusionary. In other words, the idea of secular is actually based on Christian theology. The Western historical critical method nominally deems a secular theory of history is permeated with the Christian theological idea known as original sin, which is in contradistinction from the Islamic idea of the fitrah. And this is the main difference between Islamic historiography and Western historiography. It's a fundamental difference in how both civilizations view human nature, either having husn al-dhann or su' al-dhann. Do you give people benefit of the doubt and you automatically assume that by their human nature that they're good, like Islam says with the fitrah? Or do you automatically assume that they're lying and making up reports for some sort of personal or political gain, economic gain? That would be su'adhan. And that's what the Western historical critical method says. That people by default are evil, they've inherited this original sin. They don't say that explicitly, but they imply it. And that they're going to make things up, they're going to do things for personal gain, and you can't trust hadith, therefore. And so this is really one of the first forms of epistemological genocide that Orientalists have put on the Muslims, as we mentioned before, with the Quranists, the Quraniyun, and Ignaz Goldziher. And this is the final slide. And I wanted to give you guys some more suggestions, some more readings if you're interested in learning about post-colonial theory or, just colonization in general. So Post-Colonial Theory, A Critical Introduction, 2nd edition by Leila Gandhi, is a really good place to start. It'll give you a good idea of all the types of post-colonial debates and theories out there and the history of this new field of academic inquiry. Hamid Dabashi, who is also at Columbia University, a professor there at Columbia, he wrote this book, Post-Orientalism, Knowledge and Power in a Time of Terror. And he also has this book, Can Non-Europeans Think? Of course they can, but Europe doesn't seem to think so. Then you have Talal Asad, Formations of the Secular, Christianity, Islam, and Modernity. He has another book, Secular Translations, Nation-State, Modern Self, and Calculative Reason. Above that, you see A Culture of Ambiguity, An Alternate History of Islam by Thomas Bauer, where he argues that Islam was a culture that tolerated ambiguity. Modernity does not tolerate ambiguity. Modernity wants clarity, and therefore Orientalism and other modern fields of knowledge have not been able to properly understand Islam. And he goes back to the psychoepistemic disorder that Wa'il Halaq was talking about. Then on the bottom right, you have Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, the pertinence of Islamic cosmology in the modern world, where Sheikh Professor William Chittick talks about the Islamic worldview or cosmology of Tawheed, meaning to unify, to make one. Tawheed, to make wahid, right? Whereas the cosmology of the modern world of Europe, he calls it takthir or tashriq, or you're making partners, associations, or takthir, you're making more of things. You're dividing things into all kinds of categories. You're not trying to synthesize things like Ghazali or Ibn Arabi or Ibn Taymiyyah or Fakhruddin al-Razi did. You're trying to divide and compartmentalize and get highly specialized in one small area. And you have all these binary types of thinking. And he goes in and on to what's the difference between the Islamic worldview at a very fundamental level and the European worldview. And then Wa'il Halaq in his book Ad-Dawla al-Mustahila, The Impossible State, Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament, he gets into, is Islamic State, a Dawla Islamiyya, is this an oxymoron? Can there even be such a thing as a modern nation state that is ruled by Islam? And he says no. Sharia is fundamentally at odds with this European philosophy of nation statehood. And that's why I've assigned that book as something to read and something we're going to discuss in our live session. And so without further ado, I'm going to end this lecture here. But I want you to watch 20 minutes of one of the videos that are in the recommended section of this week's module. With that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.